Hey, sports card fans, it's John, Wade Boggs fan, and welcome to another edition of Card Collecting 101. If you are fairly new to collecting sports cards, you may have heard several terms within the hobby that you may not be quite sure of what they mean. One of those terms may be super collector. What this video is going to explore are the various definitions out there that try to describe what a super collector is. And as I go over some of those definitions, I'll try to compare that to my Wade Boggs collection to see if I would qualify as a super collector based on that definition. As you'll see throughout the video, determining or defining a super collector may not be as easy as it sounds. So let's start off with some of the definitions. As I was searching for a definition of what is a super collector, I found various different ways to explain what it is. And they fell into two general categories. One were more subjective definitions, and others were more objective definitions, or at least an attempt to be more objective. So let's first discuss some of the subjective definitions of a super collector. The first one, someone that tries to collect every card of a certain player or team. Okay? Generally speaking, that would make sense. All right. But the way that definition is posed is that tries to collect. So it doesn't factor in any longevity to one's collection. For example, if you are just starting off and wanting to collect Mike Trout, and your goal is eventually to collect as many cards of Mike Trout as you possibly can, but you've only been collecting for about a year, you may have, say, 150 different cards, but your goal is to try to get as many different Mike Trout cards as you can. Does that make you a super collector because you're trying? Or the fact that I've been collecting Wade Boggs cards for over 20 years, and my goal for 20 years now has been to try to collect as many different Wade Boggs cards as possible. So, based on that definition, yes, I think I would be considered a Wade Boggs super collector. But many early stage collectors may also fall into this category and could be super collectors, even though their collection right now is rather small. So I feel this definition is a little short and doesn't quite encompass everything what it means to be a super collector. Another somewhat subjective definition of a super collector that I found was that a super collector is a hoarder of everything they can get their hands on of a particular player or team that they collect. And at some level, that makes sense. As you can see behind me, my collection of Wade Boggs goes well beyond just baseball cards of Wade Boggs. So if there's a poster, a magazine, um, various items, you name it, I try to add that to my overall Wade Boggs collection. So, in terms of that definition, I think I would be considered a super collector of Wade Boggs. However, I'm not sure that going above and beyond cards of a particular team or player are needed to be a super collector. If you have a vast collection of cards of a particular player or team, but that's all you're interested in is cards. You're not interested in decking out your room like this or having other memorabilia. You just enjoy cards of that particular player or team. I don't think that that should limit you from being considered a super collector. So I don't quite buy this definition of a super collector because that implies that you have to go beyond collecting sports cards, and personally, I don't think that that is necessary to be considered a super collector. Another definition that I found was that a super collector has obsessive tendencies about adding to their collection. Now, obsession, again, is another general broad term. Now, I can tell you personally, I have several different eBay searches regarding Wade Boggs items on eBay, and I check them religiously every day. Is that an obsessive tendency about adding to my collection? Maybe. Based on this definition, I think I may be considered a super collector, but again, this definition in my mind um, doesn't quite make the bar. I mean, having an obsessive tendency about adding to your collection, you may be a die-hard fan of your particular favorite team or player, and are just that a great fan, a passionate fan for that team or player, and want to collect some of their cards and have built up a collection of cards, maybe even cards and memorabilia. But I don't know if you have to have a quote unquote obsessive tendency to be considered a super collector. It's almost a negative connotation to say that I'm obsessed about Wade Boggs. I don't feel that I'm obsessed. I've built a collection over 20 years, and it is, looks like this. Now, I didn't do all this in 3 months. Um, it's been a long process. If I miss out on a card on eBay, I don't get angry or upset saying that, oh my gosh, I needed that card and I obsess over it. So, I don't know. Other than, again, looking through eBay saved searches on a daily basis to see what new Wade Boggs items come up, um, I don't know if I would fit this definition of a super collector. Now, here's another very subjective definition of a super collector that I found in my search, and that is their collection is heads and shoulders above most in a given category. In other words, a certain player or a certain team. Now, what's head and shoulders above one collection or another? Again, very subjective. You almost need for an outsider to know what your collection is versus someone else's collection. Like for me, I know several Wade Boggs collectors. Are all of us super collectors? Are none of us super collectors? Are a couple of us super collectors because they may be head and shoulders above others? I'm not sure. In terms of my super collection, I don't know whether my collection is head and shoulders above others. Again, I know some Wade Boggs collectors, and when it comes to either cards or memorabilia or both, they may have more. They probably do have more than I do. So, does that make them super collectors and me just a collector? I don't know. So, I don't know how my collection would fit into this definition because it is extremely subjective. And how do you compare one collection to another in terms of one being head and shoulders above another? Yet another subjective definition that I came across was that a super collector is one that when other collectors immediately think of you when that particular team or player is mentioned or discussed. Um, you know, I've seen on YouTube videos where someone will pull or show off a card of a particular team or player and give a shout out. So, for example, if someone showed off a Dodgers card, they may say, hey, shout out to Pepino Man because he likes the Los Angeles Dodgers. You may get a player collector. I may pull a Bo Bichette and say, hey, this is a shout out to Aranya Boys and Scotty because he collects Bo Bichette. Or a Pittsburgh Pirates team, I may give out a shout out to John Mangini. Or a Red Sox card, I may think of Red Sox collector Dan McGraw. So that individual who posed this definition is saying, okay, within the hobby, that if someone's discussing a certain team or player and they reference a person related to that, then that must mean that they have super collector status. Um, I don't know. I mean, I think I'm probably one of the few YouTube channels out there that promotes and shows off Wade Boggs as much as I do. So I guess that I'm becoming known within YouTube of being the one who collects Wade Boggs. So I guess in that sense, I may be considered a super collector because there are some out there that when they see a Wade Boggs card, they may think of me and my channel. Um, Again, I don't know if you have to have that particular recognition. There are a lot of Dodgers fans. There are a lot of Red Sox fans. There are a lot of Bo Bichette fans. So you get, I don't know, you may be one of, and case in point, again, a lot of YouTube videos out there. When you mention a particular player, there's multiple YouTube channels. Hey, shout out to so and so and so and so and so and so, because they all collect that particular player. So I don't know if that would necessarily mean that that makes a proper definition of a super collector. Now, the last subjective definition that I came across is one that states to be a super collector, you need to be recognized by others in the hobby as a super collector. So again, it's a term that I guess, based on this person's definition, must be granted or bestowed upon you, of saying, hey, others are saying, yes, you are a super collector. Um, so I guess in some sense that, that makes sense, that it shouldn't necessarily be a self promotion that I say I'm a Wade Boggs super collector, because I guess if no one else feels that way, then are you really a super collector? Now, the only examples that I have that may make my collection or me a Wade Boggs super collector is that I was fortunate enough back in September of 2012 in the Beckett Sports Card Monthly, they had a super collector issue. And again, I submitted an entry about my Wade Boggs collection, and they chose me as one of the featured super collectors. So, at least according to that Beckett issue, um, I'm a Wade Boggs super collector. So I don't know again if I can use that to say, hey, Beckett says I am, so I'm a super collector. So I don't know if that's enough. But one other interesting thing that I found out in doing a search for what is a super collector is when I Googled what is a super collector, about the fourth or fifth link down was a link to this article by SABR, which is Society for American Baseball Research, and one of their blogs. And back in November of 2019, one of their writers or bloggers reached out to me and my good friend Rich Davis and did a piece on our Wade Boggs collections and how we got to meet each other and to know each other, and a bit about our collections. And the title of that blog was It's a Bird, It's a Plane, It's a Super Collector. So again, there's another, if someone would need to point to an outside source, you could say, hey, I've had some articles done about me and they've called me a super collector, so I can say I'm a super collector. Again, very subjective to say that, hey, you need to have someone else define you as a super collector. I think if your own mind, you have a collection that you're proud of, um, and you want to call yourself a super collector based on some of these subjective definitions, I think you could claim that you would be. All right, as I mentioned during my searches, I found some other attempts to define being a super collector in more objective terms, rather than some of the vague definitions that I previously went over, they tried to put a specific number or target to your collection and said, okay, if you reach this level, you're considered a super collector. And if you're not quite there, you're not at super collector status. So I was a little bit more intrigued by some of these objective definitions that I found. So I did some research to see what it would mean to be a super collector of certain players based on some of these objective definitions. So let's go take a look at the first one I found. And the first one, someone had proposed that in order to be a super collector, you have to own 80% of the total amount of cards issued of that player or team. Now, 80% seems pretty high. So I dug into some of the numbers and I took a look at two players and as well as Wade Boggs. So the first one, now I based these numbers off of Beckett's checklist. Now, Beckett doesn't have every single card known in their checklist. That's how I started my Wade Boggs checklist and built off of that. And there are many items, oddball items, that Beckett doesn't have. But for this purpose, to be consistent, I went with what Beckett has for the total number of different cards for a particular player. So, according to Beckett, Mike Trout has 15,270 different cards. To meet that person's objective definition of a super collector, 80% is 12,216 different Mike Trout cards. Now, I don't follow Mike Trout collectors, but to me, having over 12,000 Mike Trout cards out of just over 15,000, I don't know if there's anyone that has a collection that large. Maybe there is someone out there, and maybe it's one person, and maybe they do deserve the only classification of a Mike Trout super collector. But to me, that is an extremely high total to reach 80%. So let's look at a newer player, Mike Yastrzemski. So he's been in the league for about a couple years, maybe 3 years, 4 years of baseball cards with some minor leagues. So he has a total of about 100 or 803 different cards. So to collect 80% of those is 642 cards. Now, if you said, hey, I have 642 cards of a particular player, it all depends on how many are out there. So you may say, oh, well, 642 cards. That shouldn't be hard. Well, depending on the serial number, if there's a lot of one of ones or very low serial number cards, it may be very difficult to get to 642 different Mike Yastrzemski cards. So let's take a look at, based on this definition, how my Wade Boggs collection fits. All right. Now, instead of using Beckett, I used my own checklist that I've developed over the years. And not including some of these art cards, these fringe cards, there are 9,324 different Wade Boggs cards that are in my checklist. I currently have 5,272 cards, what I consider to be a pretty impressive number. But that's only 57% of all the Wade Boggs cards that have been made. So based on that person's definition, I am not even close to being a super collector of Wade Boggs. So let's take a look a little bit more within some of the numbers. Let's say I remove all of the Wade Boggs one of ones and just say, where am I at with not including any one of ones? So I have 5,098 non one of one different cards. And within that checklist, there are 7,107 non one of one cards. Even then, I'm only at 72% of all the remaining Wade Boggs cards to get. Still not meeting that 80% total. So if you take it all the way back to me taking out all the cards that are serial numbered, that have a serial number of 9 or less, including one of ones, I have 4,837. And there would be a total of 6,054. only then would I reach that plateau of 80% of the Wade Boggs cards out there that I have in my collection. So I don't know. According to their definition, I am not a Wade Boggs super collector. But in many other aspects, I think I may be. So this 80% threshold may be just a little bit too high for most collectors to reach. The second objective definition that I came across is that rather than a percentage of cards made that you need to have in your collection, it is owning a certain number of different cards of that player or team. So again, an arbitrary number for one player may be super collector status, yet for a smaller number, it still may be super collector status based on the total number of cards. So again, I did a little bit more research, and let's take a look at some of the numbers. Going back to Mike Trout, again, over 15,000 different cards of Mike Trout. If you had a collection of 250 different cards, it's only 1.6% of the cards out there. If you had 500 different, 3.2%. 1,000 different Mike Trout cards, 6.5% of all the cards out there. You'd have to get to 5,000 different Mike Trout cards to even get to about a third of all the Mike Trout cards that have been issued. So the question is, what number? What number of Mike Trout cards would you have to reach to be considered a Mike Trout super collector? Is it 1,000, only having 6.5%? Is it 5,000, reaching approximately a third of his cards? Is it 2,500? Is it 6,000? So again, for Mike Trout, you may be talking about a very large number of different cards to be considered a super collector by either yourself or others. For Mike Yastrzemski, again, around 800 cards that have been issued of Mike Yastrzemski. Having 250 cards, again, from a Mike Trout standpoint, probably not that big of a Mike Trout collection. But having 250 different Mike Yastrzemski cards means that you have just under a third of all his cards. Now, 250 cards may make you a Mike Yastrzemski super collector. If you double that and say, hey, I have 500 different Mike Yastrzemski cards, now you're over 60%. I think you'd have a very strong case of saying, hey, I'm a Mike Yastrzemski super collector. And again, you could have a very good case at even 250 cards. Now, up to this point, I've been talking about just player collections. What about team collections? So I picked a team, again, focus on baseball here, that has been around the shortest amount of time, figuring that there would be less cards out there of players of a particular team. So I did a search for Tampa Bay Devil Rays or Rays cards. Over 86,000 cards have been made of players of the Devil Rays, or now the Rays. So if you said, hey, I have 5,000 different Tampa Bay Ray cards in my collection, I'd say, wow, that's pretty impressive. That's less than 6% of all the cards out there. If you said, I have a 10,000 card collection, all different, of Tampa Bay Devil Rays cards, to me, that'd be extremely impressive. It's only 11.5% of all the cards out there. So again, what number? To even have a third compared it to the Mike Trout and the Mike Yastrzemski, if you wanted to get to a third of all the cards out there for super collector status, you'd have to have 28,000 different Tampa Bay Devil Rays cards. Now, to me, I don't think you need to get to 28,000. I don't even think you would need to get to 10,000. That's just my opinion. But even though this is an attempt at an objective definition, what number makes the cut? What number for Mike Yastrzemski? What number for Mike Trout? What number for Tampa Bay Devil Rays would you be considered a super collector? The next to last objective definition that I came across was that someone proposed that if you have more cards in your collection, different cards in your collection of a particular player or team that are currently listed on COMC, then you would be considered a super collector. Now, COMC or Check Out My Cards is a website where you can buy and sell sports cards. They're not an auction website, but if you're interested in looking for cards to add to your collection, COMC could be one source for that. And they typically have, in some cases, thousands of cards for sale of a particular player. So again, this person said, hey, if I currently have more cards of a player that are listed for sale on COMC, then I must be a super collector. Well, again, let's take a look at some of the numbers. So I did a recent search on COMC for Mike Trout. And currently there are 3,746 cards listed on COMC, different. So you would have to have more than 3,746 Mike Trout cards in your collection to be considered a super collector. Now, as I showed off in previous slides, 3,746 is not a very high percentage of the overall 15 plus thousand Mike Trout cards that have been made. So again, it's one person's attempt at trying to be objective in defining what a super collector is. So again, let's look at Mike Yastrzemski. On COMC currently, there are 246 different Mike Yastrzemski cards. So previously I mentioned around 250 will get you about 30% of his collection. So if you have around 250 cards, this may be another justification for you to say, hey, I'm a Mike Yastrzemski super collector. I have roughly 30% of his cards, and I have more cards that are currently listed on COMC. Okay. For Wade Boggs, right now there are a little over 2,800 cards listed on COMC. Well, with my 5,272, I'm way above that. So according to that objective definition, I would be a Wade Boggs super collector. The last attempt at an objective definition of what is a super collector that I found is that generally they have more cards in their collection than cards that they are missing from their collection. In other words, of the available cards, they have just more than half, just over half. So they have more than what they need. Okay, makes sense. So it's basically that person is saying that, hey, you have to have at least 51% of the cards out there of a particular team or player. So again, let's take a look at the numbers. Okay, Mike Trout, you would need to have 7,636 cards in your collection. That would give you one more that you have than you are missing out of the available Mike Trout cards. For Mike Yastrzemski, you would need to have 402 cards in your collection, which would leave just under 402 that are missing from your collection. So again, it's basically saying if you have more than half. So again, for me, out of 9,324 different cards that I have in my checklist and having 5,272, that's 57%. So according to this objective definition, I would be considered a Wade Boggs super collector. Well, there you have it. Multiple definitions of what it means to be a super collector. So with all those definitions, a lot of them subjective. What does that mean? So what is a super collector? In my opinion, a super collector is someone who is very passionate about a particular player. They don't need to have a certain number of cards, a certain percentage of cards. They don't need to expand into memorabilia, if they enjoy collecting cards of their favorite team or player and have been passionate about that player or team for several years. Again, I'm not going to pigeonhole it into a particular year. And if because of your passion, you want to call yourself a fill in the blank super collector, go right ahead. This hobby is meant to be fun, to have a great time, to interact with fellow collectors. And if you want to call yourself super collector, go right ahead. If you liked this video, would appreciate a thumbs up. If you've missed some of my recent videos, you can check them out over here. If you're not a subscriber to my channel, would love you to subscribe and make sure you hit the bell so you can be notified when I upload my next video, and you can do so over here. That's all I have for you. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.